So I'm Dr. Sheetal Silal from Masha at the University of Cape Town. I'm just sharing my screen again. We'll be presenting two scenarios as part of our projections. We call them an optimistic scenario and a pessimistic scenario. These scenarios are founded on the assumption that after the 5-week lockdown, level 4 will continue for the next month, followed by a set of social distancing measures. And it's important to realize that these projections, as they are being updated on a regular basis, even these underlying assumptions of what interventions may come into force in the coming months will also be updated. So currently, our optimistic scenario assumes that our lockdown will reduce transmissibility by 60%, level 4 for the month of May by 35%, after which social distancing measures are assumed to reduce transmissibility by 20%. The pessimistic scenario makes similar reductions, but that are generally lower. So, for example, the lockdown, instead of reducing transmissibility by 60%, is projected to reduce it by 40%, and so forth. And these decreases in transmissibility are a consensus decision that has been based on a review of evidence. And as with the majority of the assumptions that are used in our model, they are the product of consensus decision from the National COVID Modeling Consortium, as well as global literature and new research as it emerges. So before I speak about the short-term and the long-term projections, I think it's important for us to understand the difference in underlying assumptions or theory between the two. In the short term, we acknowledge that the COVID-19 epidemic had seeded differently at different times in the different provinces and in communities with varying contact behavior. And in particular, that there will be clusters of cases, sharp increases, as we've seen in some provinces. And these are divergent from, say, the average pattern of how the disease might progress. But in the long term, we assume that these differences, which are larger at the beginning of an epidemic, will reduce over time as the epidemic progresses. So in the long run, we do make the assumption that the biological characteristics of the disease, its progression and its severity, will be similar across the 9 provinces. So having a look here at the short-term projections, which were projections made for the month of May, from the beginning to the end of May, we do project that by the end of May, that there would be approximately 30,000 detected cases. And as Professor Pulliam mentioned before, we do present large uncertainty bands along with these projections. So an uncertainty band of between 18,000 and 54,000 cases. Now, detected cases are particularly hard to project because it is not just a function of the underlying disease in the population, but also of how testing may progress in the next few weeks or in the next month. And it also depends on the testing strategy that is used, and we know that this differs across the country. So if we focus on the plots, on the top right, on the top left-hand corner, we've got active cases, that too symptomatic active cases. It's important to note the distinction between these active cases and other sets of active cases that are reported. In our projections, we define the symptomatic active cases to be a function of those that have been detected, that we know are positive, but also those active symptomatic cases in the population that are yet to be detected. So it would be larger than active cases currently reported along with the daily updates. In terms of hospital use, the use of hospital resources, we look at the top right-hand corner at the non-ICU beds currently in use, and it is predicted by the end of May, we would expect there to be approximately 2,000 beds in use across the country, with a range of between 1,000 and 4,000. When it comes to ICU beds, we are projecting that by the end of May, there'd be an average of around 500 ICU beds in use, and that varying between 250 and about 900, or just under 1,000 ICU beds in use. And we can relate the ICU beds currently to the threshold that exists in the country. And this threshold is approximately 3,300 beds. When it comes to projected deaths in the bottom right-hand corner, we are estimating that by the end of the month, the cumulative death projection would be around 475, and that too with a large band of between 300 and 700 deaths by the end of the month. And when we move forward to the long-term projection, remembering again the distinction that in the long term we're looking at average behavior in the provinces, the first thing we do is to compare the situation we expect ourselves to be in now after the lockdown compared to the case of no intervention. But before I even get into this graph, we mentioned uncertainty in our predictions and uncertainty with respect to COVID-19. I think that is particularly highlighted in the long-term projections. We are the middle of May right now, and so COVID-19 has only been around in the world for 4.5 months. And here we are trying to make projections on the entire span of the epidemic for the next 6 to 8 months. So there's considerable uncertainty in how the epidemic is going to fully play out into the future. And so we do acknowledge that this particular plot of what will happen in the next 6 to 8 months is going to be updated and most likely going to be changing with every update. But what we can show from the plot right now is that the lockdown from a modeling perspective is indeed shown to flatten the curve and to push our curve out later, the peak later, more so in the optimistic scenario, that's the solid line, compared to the pessimistic scenario, the dashed line, though both of these are considerably later in terms of the peak and lower in terms of the peak of infections compared to the no intervention scenario. So looking forward now to the long-term projections and breaking these down into the use of resources, estimated deaths, and active symptomatic cases. If you have to look at our cumulative deaths, we are projecting that under the optimistic scenario, the blue set of curves, that there would be just over 40,000 deaths cumulatively by November. And this picks up perhaps to around 48,000 deaths in the pessimistic scenario. And as I mentioned, that even these projections may change as other interventions come into play and transitioning between levels occurs in the future. But taking our assumptions of a level 4 restriction for the next month and social distancing thereafter, just over 40,000 deaths are what we are predicting to occur by November. When we look at the admissions, the use of hospital non-ICU beds and ICU beds, they present an interesting scenario. Let us look first at the ICU beds in use. That's the bottom left-hand corner plot. We've got what we are showing in the plot, that whether we are going to follow the optimistic trajectory of the epidemic or the pessimistic trajectory of the epidemic, the threshold of ICU beds are projected to be exceeded. And they're projected to be exceeded quite early on in the epidemic. The optimistic projections being in July or just after the start of July, and the pessimistic predictions in June. And while we look at the top right-hand corner at the non-ICU beds in use, it appears at first glance that our general hospital beds might be sufficient for the entire period of the epidemic, looking at the optimistic curve, and for the majority of the pessimistic curve. But we need to interpret these graphs together, both the ICU bed use and the non-ICU bed use. When the bed threshold is exceeded, those requiring but not getting an ICU bed will be occupying a general hospital bed or a non-ICU bed. And so what we are seeing as the number of cases above the ICU bed threshold, they will actually be eating into the total or using up the total from the general bed threshold. So what we can expect actually is that the general bed threshold can be exceeded quite a bit early on in the epidemic. because we will be taking into account those who require ICU beds but are not getting them, as well as those who require non-ICU bed services. So these two plots need to be interpreted together.